Alrighty. Well, hello everyone. It's 10:01. We're going to get started. People are still coming into the lobby, but we will get started. Welcome to the latest installment of our VCIO webinar series. Today we're going to be discussing the serverless office and the move away from on-prem infrastructure for SMB clients. My name is Rick Vines. I'm joined by my colleague John Cole, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us. We expect the agenda items today will take about 45 minutes, and that should leave us enough time for questions at the end. Our agenda today is as follows. We'll start with introductions and our goals for today. I'll go through a brief background on Sikich. I will provide a high-level overview of what we're seeing as the move to the serverless office. And then John will go through a serverless migration strategy from the solution architect perspective, and then dive into a migration scenario. And lastly, we'll go through wrap up, next steps, and answer any questions. If you do have any questions at any point, just put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So again, my name is Rick Vines. I am a VCIO or Virtual Chief Information Officer here at Sikich. I go back several decades in the IT industry. Most recently, I ran an MSP here in Chicago for about 20 years. I've always liked working directly with clients. And as a VCIO, I get to work with our clients' leadership teams over the long term to help them develop their IT strategy, roadmap, and budget. As we work together to identify areas of focus on the roadmap, I work with our solution architect team to put together the solutions, and that's why I'm happy to have John here so he can add his perspective. John, can you give some background on yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Rick. My name is John Cole. I'm a solution architect here at Sikich. So on the technical side of things, I work with Rick and other VCIOs along with other technical teams in a pre-sales and delivery aspect to help formulate technical requirements and to develop proposals that coincide and align with the organization's strategy. So underlying like licensing, methodologies, new updates, anything from a technical perspective, so we can put those proposals together and have a successful project once it goes to our deployment teams.
All right, thanks, John. So as far as goals for today, I looked through the list of attendees, and we do have a mix of technical and non-technical folks on the call. I'll try and keep my part of things at a high level and non-technical. John will go into more technical detail, but this is by no means a technical deep dive into cloud migrations. So if there are more technical questions or more detailed questions that do come up, we'd be happy to answer them offline if you'd like. What we hope you'll walk away today with is a greater understanding of the considerations and options that we use in our process in assisting clients to plan and execute a technology strategy, and in particular, an on-prem to cloud migration. So I know we have some existing clients on the call, but for those that aren't already familiar with Sikich, I want to give a brief overview. As a technology partner, Sikich is somewhat unique in that we have broader capabilities in-house than many traditional MSPs. Our technology group is one of the three service areas that make up Sikich. In addition to the technology group, we have the audit, accounting, and tax group, which is where Sikich was founded and is currently one of the largest CPA firms in the US. We also have our advisory group that works with clients in a variety of areas like we see listed here, such as, just to name a few, business succession planning, marketing and communications, investment banking. As we work with clients on our side, we're lucky to have a wide range of internal experts that we can turn to as necessary. We've been in business for 38 years, do business across the entire US and even globally. Across the whole organization, we have over 15,000 clients, now over 1,500 employees. The typical size of our clients ranges from upper SMB to upper mid-market. We do have some enterprise clients, mostly within our Dynamics 365 and cybersecurity practices. Our technology practice currently has about 500 employees, and we're made up of three main areas. our business applications practice, which includes ERP, spend management, CRM. This practice is primarily involved with the implementation, customization, integration, and support of applications like NetSuite, Microsoft Dynamics 365, Salesforce, and Coupa, which is a new one for us. Our cyber security practice provides end-to-end security services, including penetration testing and vulnerability scanning, governance, risk, and compliance, including PCI, NIST, CMMC, among others. Our SIEM and SOC, which is where we compile and analyze all the logs and alerts, and where we manage and respond to threats, as well as our forensics, where we analyze and investigate threats and breaches, as well as other managed security services. Our IT solutions group, which is a practice that both John and I are part of, assists clients with building and managing their IT infrastructure, as well as supporting their users, and covers areas like managed IT, cloud services, strategy, budgeting, and road mapping, as I mentioned before, as well as disaster recovery planning and testing. So as it relates to what we're going to talk about today, we're fortunate in our group to have the ability to rely on all these other practices to help us plan and implement a successful migration. So as I meet with my clients during our quarterly business reviews, a large part of that process is to understand their business and help develop a technology roadmap and budget. What I'm seeing more and more is that the roadmap includes replacing some or all of their on-premise infrastructure and moving things to the cloud. And while this was already on the radar, I think we see the first bullet. I'm sorry. Well, this is already this is already on the radar for some of our clients, but some factors, like what you see here, are making it a preferred option for many more. The pandemic was a huge factor. It really accelerated the move to a remote workforce, which highlighted, some of the challenges clients were having delivering technology to remote users. With so many fewer workers in the office, clients began to rethink their office arrangements. So paying for office space, for servers on-prem, when the workforce is primarily working remotely, no longer makes much sense. The capabilities of the cloud platforms have matured and are now performing as well or even better in some cases than on-prem infrastructure, both for remote and local users. Clients can also leverage additional capabilities offered by these various platforms, especially in the area of collaboration. Bandwidth is fast, reliable, and inexpensive, so we don't have to worry as much as we used to about having data local to users, especially when most users aren't in the office anyway. Line of business application vendors are rapidly pivoting to cloud software as a service. The SaaS versions of these applications now have equal or better performance capabilities than their on-prem versions, and the vendors are creating incentives for clients to move to the cloud versions, or in some case, forcing them to move. In addition, clients have become more experienced over the last few years and trusting of the cloud in general, and their users, have become more accustomed and comfortable using cloud applications. So as we're building out these roadmaps and discussing it with clients and looking towards the future, clients are far less apprehensive than they were just a few years ago. Security is another driving factor, partly because of the requirements to obtain cyber insurance are increasingly more difficult. And we're finding that moving to the cloud platforms can sometimes make it easier for clients to comply. And lastly, many clients are getting to the end of a technology cycle with their on-prem servers, office operating systems, or line of business applications. Others are shrinking their office footprint. So they're, in essence, being forced to make a decision. reinvest in their current infrastructure, or move to the cloud. And as we sit here today, moving to the cloud is becoming the preferred choice whenever possible. So if the decision looks like we want to move to the cloud model for some or all applications, we have to begin to look at what options are available. And what we're looking at here is called the cloud responsibility chart. And it's a good high-level representation of the various cloud platforms available. There's three basic cloud platforms from left to right. We have infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. Through the discovery process with the client, we arrive at the best option based on what's the most appropriate fit for that client environment. So you may be familiar with these options, but I want to just take a few minutes to go through them. Infrastructure as a service is where we are either building or moving virtual machines within the provider's infrastructure. So something like Azure Virtual Machines or Amazon EC2. Sikich is primarily aligned with Microsoft, so Azure is always going to be our preferred option, but we do have clients using other platforms. With infrastructure as a service, there's still an underlying operating system, either Microsoft or Linux, but the virtualization, server, storage, and networking is all managed by the provider. Platform as a service is a pre-built platform where clients can build, develop, deploy, or manage their own applications. So something like Azure SQL Database or Azure Logic Apps. There's dozens of others. So in the case of SQL, we wouldn't build or migrate a SQL server. We would build or migrate a SQL database and run it within the server provider platform. There's no OS for us to manage. Software as a service is what we all commonly know as cloud-based applications, and there's hundreds of these. This is where the provider builds and manages all components of the infrastructure and application. So something like Office 365, NetSuite, Business Central, QuickBooks Online. The only thing we would move in the case of software as a service would be the data. Every migration is going to include one or more of these platforms, and that all really depends on the details of the particular client environment. One of the other things that this chart points out is that when you move from on-prem to one of these cloud platforms, the responsibility for management of certain parts of the infrastructure transfers to the service provider. It's also important to remember that in all cases, the ultimate responsibility for the data still rests with the client, and that comes into play when planning for security or disaster recovery. It's also important to remember that although the service provider may be providing, may be responsible for managing the various components within the infrastructure, we, along with the client, are still responsible for the design, configuration, customization, administration, and support. So once we've identified the path we want to follow, the process to scope, budget, and execute is pretty straightforward and follows a similar path that we use for all of the IT projects within IT solutions. We start with the discovery and scoping process with our solutions architects and the client team. The details of this process will really depend on our existing knowledge of the client and the client environment and the complexity of the project in general. To scope and plan the project, we're able to leverage some project templates that we've built over the years and can use them as guides to develop the plan and general budget. Often these types of projects don't happen all at once, so it might be a series of smaller projects executed over a longer timeline. Once the plan, budget, and timelines are agreed to, then the next step is to develop and provide a detailed proposal for the client to review. In all cases, we want to ensure there's a common understanding of the project details and goals, including costs and timelines. And once the proposal is approved, there's a dedicated project manager who sets up the project plans, manages a dedicated project team, and executing through completion. During the course of the project, there are regular project meetings, and the VCIO and solutions architect remain involved throughout. In situations where we're working in concert with an internal IT team or a third party to handle some of the project tasks, that coordination is accommodated in the plan. So hopefully that's given you some background on the cloud migration process from my perspective. I'd like to turn things over to John to walk you through his insights from the perspective of a solution architect.
Great, thanks, Rick. So there you have the integration and the involvement of a VCIO from a strategic level, and then moving into a serverless migration strategy as a solution architect. We try to focus on the technology, but also the business need and what can be solved, what problem are we solving for. So there's lots of questions that we like to ask, and we can sort of formulate that or compile that down, consolidate it into a couple questions to ask. And so I like to start with the why, the what, the where, and the how. So all of these are vitally important to the process, and the timing or the sequence of them can also dictate how the project might go or how the future might go. The why is really determining what's the need or the reasoning to change the environment structure. Moving to the cloud makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. Sometimes an organization, they just have a very futuristic vision or goals that, here's where we want to be. We want to be no servers in our offices. We don't want to be tied down to hardware and refresh cycles and those associated costs, even though it's sometimes moving the bucket from where the costs are at, moving into a more operational expenditure type environment versus a capital expenditure makes a lot of sense. It allows for better forecasting and budgeting and seeing what our spend's going to be and scalability, those sorts of things. So some are we're cloud first only. The hardware refresh is a big thing. You have servers sitting out there. You don't want them to be too old. You're tied to a provider or a specific provider and what warranties are available and parts and all that sort of struggle and how many years are we going to wait, and the underlying operating systems as well. So there's a lot involved besides just the applications and the data. Another component is, do we have a problem with access to resources? Do we need better visibility? Do we need better accessibility? And almost always the answer is yes, which will feed into our next sections on how we address that. As Rick alluded to, in the past several years, there's been a large increase in a distributed or remote workforce. So this is, comes with challenges, but also provides a lot of benefits in that when your workforce isn't consolidated into offices, depending on the type of work that's being done, it does open the door to talent to where you don't have to have someone in your office to give you the highest level of quality or output that you expect in that role. And in doing so, you need to make sure that as much as possible, that their experience is equal or at least reasonable in comparison to a user who would be in the office, and cloud has a lot to do with that. Security concerns, whether that's identity management and control and multi-factor, and really just serving the purposes of consolidating your footprint of where can people log in, how are they logging in, and then providing or integrating with security products, whether that's a SIM or some other log analytics tool or a third-party provider like an MSSP, those types of services. Cloud a lot of times is more friendly in that aspect because it provides an easier surface area to integrate with APIs and direct native integration with a lot of cloud providers. Redundancy and availability. You can leverage a host of products, some native to that cloud platform like Azure or Amazon, to where infrastructure can be replicated or be a part of certain redundancy solutions to where you can limit your downtime and you don't need additional hardware and storage in on-premises clusters to achieve the same thing. And sometimes it's even demand-based scalability, which can be done on premises, but with licensing and hardware, you sort of have to constantly be maintaining an environment that can handle that workload. So cloud is much more flexible in that standpoint. And then the final option here is just footprint consolidation. Sometimes an organization realizes that we have these many offices, we've done this over the years, there's sort of pieces of hardware and software everywhere. How do we sort of consolidate that to where we can manage it more effectively, but also provide reasonable access, performance, redundancy, backup, all the things we mentioned before. So the why is really important. I think it's okay to say, we want to be cloud first. Our organization really wants to be ahead of the curve, or at least moving with the trend and not behind, and that's great. But without good, solid reasoning, it's going to be hard to convince any stakeholders that, number one, to justify the costs or to justify the effort to get to that point, because there will be sometimes a significant level of effort to achieve that goal. And so establishing good reasoning behind it is critical. The next thing to consider is the what. And what I mean by that is what you have or what your environment looks like. So determining where to go is much easier after analyzing what's in place. So we sort of have the why. Here's some issues, or here's some areas that we can see some growth. And sometimes we can get ahead of ourselves and say, well, this is the cloud option this is where I want to go. But without analyzing what you have in your environment, that project is going to be much more difficult, or it might just be the wrong direction. Cloud in general is not the wrong direction, but a specific application or a specific place in the cloud or specific solution might not fit your organization for the type of workloads and structure that you have. So things to consider to help in these decisions: identity and authentication. Are you using, Active Directory domain services on domain controllers? Are you using a third-party identity provider? Are your identities coming from like a Salesforce, an Okta, OneLogin, some other identity product where you're integrating? What types of resources do I have? So that could be like server hardware, types of applications, data, other workloads, line of business applications and their dependencies, whether that's an ERP, a CRM, a custom application, financial software, if you have different bolt-ons, add-ons, the Office suite, email, collaboration, all those types of tools. Knowing what you have allows you to sort of find the right bucket to put it in. How is your endpoint management being done? Is it being done by group policy, another MDM solution? And you might not be integrated with anything in the cloud yet. But there's a lot of options depending on what you have. Remote access, right? If you're on premises, you're probably leveraging VPN, remote desktop services, Citrix. You could be leveraging Azure Virtual Desktop already, but it depends on where your server infrastructure or your application infrastructure is. It might not be the most harmonious fit. Server hardware, what are you doing for backups and redundancy? Are those being replicated, and to where? Is there immutable storage for that? Are you held to any compliance requirements? Licensing, right? Are you licensing your Windows workloads with server licensing from Microsoft that has software assurance or something that you're ongoing, so that way you're entitled to the latest version, or some of them sort of mismatched and you don't have that ability, because that'll also affect your cloud decision as well. And overall, I think one of the most important things that we can always say we need to analyze the costs and know what they cost, but the overall costs, even in soft costs, so the management costs, as it were. So sometimes in comparing on-premises infrastructure and cloud infrastructure, someone might say, well, this is going to cost me monthly and the server doesn't have hard costs there. Well, in reality, because you have the hard costs of the server hardware, the operating system, upgrades, the storage, all those sorts of things, that's going to cost you at some point, and maintaining it and being responsible, as Rick showed on the cloud responsibility chart, in on-premises, you're responsible for all of it. Whereas if you shift to whether like infrastructure as a service or platform as a service type offerings, depending on that workload, you can really choose what's going to be best long-term. And that leads us to the where. So we've asked ourselves, why are we moving? What issues do we have? What are our organization's goals? We've analyzed the environment, or at least asked the question to begin that process. And those two together, after analyzing the what, you can better determine the where. And so some of the most common options up here are listed. So Microsoft 365. I don't think it's outlandish to say that a large majority of people, of organizations, have shifted to at least using the Exchange Online components of Microsoft 365 to no longer have to maintain on-premises Exchange servers or other mail server services that come along with patching and zero-day exploits and lots of different risk, and also internet connections and bandwidth and redundancy at a single physical site. or multiple sites, but still. Teams for collaboration, or as a front end for SharePoint for file storage and other forms of collaboration and workflows and processes. Intune via Microsoft 365 for your endpoint management to be able to have configuration policies and software policies, and really maintaining those sort of group policy, as it were, type standards of an MDM solution in Intune. So things have come things have come a long way from where they were, and they've really matured to offer a similar level of control and manageability of systems, even without on-premises Active Directory. Azure, Azure AD, which is also the backend for Microsoft 365 for the identity and user management piece. There are different levels and different features of things that you can do. But Azure AD is a major component because not only is it just for a user account, but it can be used to really centralize your user identity management and the origin of identity to integrate with other applications and other third-party providers to say, where are my users? Do I have to have 50 user accounts? If I'm using multi-factor, how do I enforce that? Do I have to have all these tools? Azure AD has roughly 4,000 or more native applications that you can even integrate to enable things like single sign-on, which allows other policies or to be effective in controlling where can people log in from. If I need to terminate an employee, where do I have to shut it all off? Being able to consolidate things into an identity management system in the cloud is really beneficial because it can simplify the onboarding and offboarding steps, and also provide less work for your users to know users and passwords and MFA enforcement, all those sorts of things. And some of the main offerings in Azure are infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. So infrastructure as a service, like Rick alluded to, is really more like running virtual machines and pieces of infrastructure in the cloud, in the cloud environment. And while there are other cloud providers like Amazon Web Services and GCP, Google Cloud Platform, Sikich is very aligned with Microsoft, and Azure is sort of our tool of choice in that way, especially for Windows workloads. So infrastructure as a service, sometimes we need servers, we just don't want to be on premises. How can we get these into the cloud but still maintain a similar level of manageability for the operating systems and the underlying applications and software? Platform as a service allows you the opportunity to sort of have a similar effect of infrastructure. So a lot of times, like SQL, there's a lot of SQL options in Azure that if you have a single database or you have a single SQL instance that you really don't want to maintain the version of SQL, the operating system, all these different patches, but you do need that functionality. It could be the back end for a web application, or even a full middleware type client application. It allows you to have that functionality, although sometimes there's certain restrictions, but without having to maintain and be responsible for all those other pieces that would add costs and complexity to maintaining and monitoring it. And things like Azure Logic Apps and Functions, to where truly functional type things to leverage code and APIs to integrate applications without needing dedicated server or dedicated infrastructure to run that. The how. So this is the final question per se, and the how will depend on what you have and where you're going to go, and even your reasons why. A lot of times we find that partner engagement is probably the number one most important step. You're going to have different levels of partners. Sikich, as a managed service provider, for our managed clients, we're highly integrated and very intimately familiar with their environments and their business needs and their flow of operations and how things work. So that can help us more effectively help the organization in achieving their goals and moving to the cloud, because there's less discovery, there's less to find out. We're sort of ahead of the game in that way. So from a partner standpoint, a couple options really. They can be to scope out and provide professional services for an entire project from start to finish. So discovery, the scoping, the delivery, implementation, project management, all those pieces completely done by a partner like Sikich. Or sometimes we start with performing an assessment. An assessment is a great way to determine the what, to have a third party either do it all or assist to say, let's do a complete analysis. Let's make sure we're not missing anything. Because before the train gets rolling, a train's very hard to slow down once it's already up to speed. So let's make sure we have all the pieces that we need before proceeding, so we can make sure that our why has informed us properly, and our where is the right destination. So when we get to the how piece, everything is accounted for appropriately. There's other ways that partners can be engaged to assist with stages. You might be a client that has internal IT staff that handles certain applications and some proprietary workloads and applications that are really specific to your company. And so instead of saying, Sikich can't help or a partner can't help, we would say, let us analyze and choose what each team's going to do. A lot of times the partner will focus on like the infrastructure in the back end and making sure that it's going, and all the underlying middleware and configurations and things that are really specific that only someone inside the business would know can handle those. And that way that it's a successful project, but it's done in conjunction and collaboratively with the client. You might need a partner just to provide some licensing or software that you need. You're going to handle all the services and things like that, but you need licensing. Or it's just a consulting engagement. We have the talent, we have the ability. There's just too many options, and we need some help to establish where we're at, what we have, and where we need to go. And we'll take it from there. We're just trying to choose where we can go. And so a partner like Sikich has the technical expertise to sit down with stakeholders from the executive level all the way down to department heads and users to determine and make a reasonable assumption and decision about this is the direction that's going to be recommended for you to go. So then you can execute on that plan. Some of those options have internal team involvement to share and task workload. Typically, a partner like Sikich or Sikich would prefer to project manage a project, even though some tasks would be done by internal parties. So that way, the entire scope of the project is really accounted for, and we know where we're at in the process. And there's reporting that can be done, so that way stakeholders in the project are aware of, even if the task itself isn't being done by Sikich. The project management piece is very helpful. The internal team definitely involved in testing and any proprietary solution management. How can be determined by methodologies and best practices. So choosing the correct option for migration based on the needs and future goals. That could be in reference to a Teams, a SharePoint, or Exchange Online migration, or the method by which you're going to migrate your on-premises hardware servers or virtual servers into an infrastructure as a service solution. There's different ways to migrate those. Azure offers a lot of different ways. Amazon offers different ways. Some are very manual, some are automated via tools, but having the expertise to know is really where Sikich can make the difference. A staged approach or a cutover approach, like Rick said, depending on the scope of the project, it could be a series of projects. We're going to move this piece, then we'll move this piece, and we'll move this piece, to where it's a gradual change. Some organizations have to do that due to sheer size and complexity. Other smaller organizations or organizations that don't have as much or going on can maybe just do a cutover and take multiple services or multiple areas into the cloud without too much labor and effort. And knowing which method is going to be appropriate for that is definitely important. Pilot programs. So we're not sure we want to take on a full migration. We want to test it out. Those are options. A critical piece here, user and stakeholder training, making sure that users or their managers or their teams know what's coming before it happens. That's a big piece for us, especially with internal teams that have involved Sikich, to say, hey, we need help with this cloud migration. Many times we're already co-managing that infrastructure with that IT team. And when something changes, Sikich can provide that training to those users, even from an administration standpoint. So that way, when something changes, they're not just scrambling. Sikich is there to help, but being proactive in that way allows the fear to subside, or the fear of change to subside, because they're more ready. You're more ready to know what's coming and what to expect. And the compatibility and confirmation and analysis. Like I said, don't get ahead of yourself. If you're looking at your applications, there's lots of things to consider how we're going to move it. Is the operating system approaching end of life? Are we going to do a server upgrade, an operating system upgrade, which then makes the version of the application that's running on that server also out of date, which then comes to the point of, well, are we going to upgrade that application, or are we moving away from the application in 2 years? So all those decisions, the methodology of how to move that, really are informed by that what portion, that assessment portion of what do we have, what are the underlying dependencies. So now that we've sort of taken a high-level view of approach and analysis and process, we've come up with a scenario that we want to present to sort of show you the transformation of, where they were to where they're going to be. So in this scenario, we're going to start with the why. This organization has hardware that's aging for the server infrastructure. They've got SANs that are coming up on end of life. They're analyzing the cost of replacing them. Is it going to be worth it? And then just to do that again in a few years. They have several different Windows Server OSs. So Server 2012 R2, 1619, it's sort of across the spectrum. They're not consistent across the board, and most of that's due to some legacy applications. Remote access is complex and isn't seamless for all employees because they're working out of different offices. They have a distributed workforce. Some are remote, some are offshore, some are, so that makes remote access very challenging. They're not leveraging productivity capabilities that the cloud can offer, like Teams or SharePoint. Security is becoming more difficult because of the size that the organization has come to and all the different pieces, and where are we going to collect those logs? Who's going to look at them? How are we going to do that? And now they have a new business arm that has compliance and archival requirements for email. Their ERP solution is going to need upgraded. So they're analyzing, are we going to do that on-prem? Are we going to the cloud? What's going to be the best fit for us? They're looking to avoid upgrade costs for line of business applications and operating systems where possible to sort of alleviate that operating cost in the future and establish a more centralized management for applications, identity management, licensing, and remote access. So now we're moving into the what is in place here. They have on-premise domain controllers and file servers, a couple on-premises applications, including a custom web-based application with a SQL backend and an ERP. They're using Dynamics Nav. An on-prem Exchange server. They're getting their Office licensing via volume licensing, but they're buying it retail every few years, and so there's some version disparity across users. They have servers in multiple Office locations to facilitate some logon, some file. They're using a combination of remote desktop services and VPN for remote access. They've grown. Their user base is geographically distributed, so a lot of users are still in the office, but there's many who aren't or are doing a hybrid approach. They already do have some cloud SaaS line of business applications like a Salesforce CRM, compliance requirements for email and other communications. They have an on-premises hardware unit, which works with their Exchange server that's there, but that's another liability, another risk that they're going to have to keep managing and keep available for the retention period that's required by their requirements. And they do have Windows Server volume licensing with software assurance. So they do have some of that. And so we'll see moving into the where to go for this organization after analyzing what they have, what their needs are, and what they can utilize to the best of their ability. We think we would make the decision that there's going to be sort of a hybrid approach per se. In Azure, we're going to leverage infrastructure as a service to run multiple servers in Azure. So this is going to take care of the ERP system that's right now, because currently that's on Server 2012 R2. So as you know, that's going to be end of life soon, and they're not transitioned yet, and they're going to need to keep that for some archive purposes. So that's going to transition to servers. We're going to run Active Directory domain controllers on VMs in Azure instead of like an Azure AD domain services platform as a service, just because there's server infrastructure involved and we don't want to spin up a new Active Directory domain, things like that, some requirements. So that's going to be best in this situation. Their custom app is going to be converted to use an Azure SQL managed instance for the back end, and then Azure Web Apps for the front end. So that sort of takes the hardware and the OS management and cost portion completely out of it. It's a platform as a service. So there's a lot of features to where they can develop test code and do upgrades and modify the SQL instance backend as well without having to run full servers and manage separate licensing and all those sorts of things. We're going to recommend Azure Virtual Desktop for remote users where required. So that could be users that are 100% remote and don't have a workstation or not in the office, or they're offshore people who are remote. It provides a lot of flexibility. It provides a consistent point of authentication to where once they're connected, that client, the Azure Virtual Desktop client, is supported on so many different pieces of hardware that not only can they connect and then have a better experience because of performance and access to the data that's in a U.S. North American data center. It also prevents data from being on their devices. So any compliance requirements or any, it allows better integration for any BYOD, bring your own device type users that they have, and allows better control. Backup and DR, for this standpoint, we're going to use Azure native tools and replicate those between geographic regions and provide, take snapshots of disks and those sorts of things. Sometimes you can leverage other products, but in this scenario, based on what they have, a lot of their servers, the next phase is to sort of decommission the archive servers from the ERP and domain controllers and move them into a full cloud joined environment. But this is sort of an intermediate step. Leveraging Azure AD, so synchronizing it with their Active Directory domain to use it as the primary source for their other applications. So they're moving, you'll see on here, they're moving to Dynamics 365 Business Central, which is going to use Azure AD for the identities. So we want to synchronize those with the users in Active Directory, so that way it's clear there's only one user account, and we can enforce multi-factor and conditional access for the Azure Virtual Desktop, for Teams, for SharePoint, for really any resources that we integrate with Azure AD. And it makes a whole lot of sense, especially with the risk factor of having overseas employees or people that are traveling. There's a lot of items that can be done more effectively that way. The Microsoft 365 platform, we're going to migrate their on-premises Exchange to Exchange Online. In their licensing, provide their Office suite, and then utilize Intune. So the workstations are going to be Azure AD hybrid joined, so they're joined to the local domain, but also cloud. So it allows a better way to manage both and provide access to server resources to those users on their workstations until those server resources are gone. We're going to leverage the Defender suite for those endpoints, and also for Defender for 365 Plan 1 or Plan 2 for some additional spam and sort of email filtering there. Doing file migrations for those workloads to SharePoint Online using a Teams front end, so that way things are very collaborative and organized. You know where all your shares are because you can just go to Teams, click on the teams that you're in, and then see all of them. And you can choose to sync them with OneDrive or sync the shortcuts with OneDrive, whatever works for that user based on policy that's allowed. As I mentioned, the MFA with conditional access is going to help control who, how, and where they can authenticate to any of those services integrated with Azure AD. Autopilot is going to be used to help in the provisioning process for the remote employees. It's a feature that, since they're hybrid joined with Azure AD in the local domain, the user accounts are going to synchronize, and we can help speed up that provisioning process and provide somewhat of an image or a standard default point, a standard build to help keep things consistent with all their applications and their licensing for anyone that gets full device that way. There will still be MFA involved for the management of on-premises devices. So more for like network management of switches, firewalls, HVAC components, those sorts of things. So we're going to integrate that VPN using multi-factor with Azure AD. Other cloud solutions, they're going to integrate cloud compliance platforms. So whether that's Smarsh, Mimecast, that can integrate natively with 365. So that way, and they'll do a data export and ingestion into that cloud provider. So only have one cloud provider that's responsible for all their archive data, and they don't need any hardware or anything like that on premises to manage that. We're going to integrate third-party backups for Microsoft 365 because even though the data is there and it's redundant, if someone deletes it maliciously or accidentally and a threshold expires, it's going to go away. And so the best way to prevent yourself from that sort of issue is to make sure you have a third-party backup, whether that's like a Sikich or Dropsuite or countless providers that you can integrate that gives you retention for those if in the case of some sort of event. Third-party print management. We would implement this for local print devices for users, so that way you wouldn't be reliant on traditional Windows Server print servers. Print services, which can, from going cloud to on-premises, can take more time. A product like PrintX or something similar would provide that functionality. And that final part, Dynamics 365 Business Central, that migration, that actually another arm in Sikich is very specialized in that area and is helping with that. So that way, those archive servers will go away at some point in the future, and they'll be on a new cloud SaaS-based model for that important part of the business. And how to get there, we'll go through this a little bit quickly as we already talked about it. It's really, there was partner engagement. We did a formal assessment to determine the what. It's a partner managed team project with internal team engagement for those custom app components. And the team has to work with the ERP team at Sikich to then, for all the requirements and testing required to do something as large as an ERP migration. So all the tasks we went to before and the how are done here. The user and stakeholder training, Azure AD has to be migrated to Azure AD, the file migration to SharePoint, implementation of Teams in OneDrive, the builds of servers and the migration of those applications, confirmation of the compatibility, so any upgrades that are required or installed, testing and confirming this level of access works with their different user base and the different things they need access to, the configuration and deployment of Intune and the profile migrations and the MFA enforcement. All these tasks that we talked about that need to be done are done here and over a long period of time. So some of these happen together, but it's really a staged approach. But in this case, it was a large project to get to this point, which then they'll shift from there. So that's from a high level, that should be the transformation that they have. So with that, I'll go back to you, Rick.
Well, thanks, John. I know that was a lot to go through in such a short period of time, but I appreciate it. We'll get to the wrap up here. I just thought I'd sort of summarize what we're hearing from clients. As I mentioned, we're doing more and more of these projects. So what we're hearing from clients, some things are, one of the big things is they're able to deliver the same experience to users regardless of their location. So they can work from anywhere, anytime, and their experience is the same. Clients are able to reduce, John mentioned this too, they're shifting to more of a subscription-based or monthly-based billing. So their budgeting is easier, fewer capital expenditures. I think I have my bullet points messed up here. They're able to reduce the risk and cost of having their own server room, so they don't have to have the server space. They don't have to have things like UPSs and as much redundancy within their server room. They're able to eliminate their hardware refresh cycle. So we do that very often with clients. Every 6 or 7 years, we're looking at replacing a bunch of equipment, and it's a big project and a fairly large capital expenditure. Once clients have moved off from their on-prem to cloud platforms, the disaster recovery, business continuity, and security things still need to be addressed, but the capabilities that exist within the new cloud platforms are enhanced. And I think one of the most important things is that the technology discussion that we start to have with clients once they've done this moves away from hardware and software and moves to things like applications and productivity. And I think one of the things that we hear from clients as well is they enjoy being part of these platforms where the provider is continually enhancing the capabilities and features and even what applications are included. So Office 365 2 years ago compared to what Office 365 offers today, there's many new capabilities. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. We appreciate you joining us today. Hopefully, if you're in a position where you're wondering if you can eliminate your on-prem infrastructure, is that the right path? There's a good chance it's possible, based on our experience, to completely move away or significantly reduce your on-prem footprint. So I hope we've provided some information that helps you in your thinking. Looks like Mike there's a poll here that we'd like you to participate in. We'll give people a few minutes to respond. Doesn't look like we have any questions. No questions. All right. Well, if you want to get in touch with myself or John directly, our contact information is here on your screen. If you want to general contact with Sikich and our IT solutions groups. It's up there as well. There will be a follow-up communication to everybody that attended this that'll include a copy of the slide deck as well as a recording of the webinar. Again, thank you very much for taking your time to join us today. Hope it was informative, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.